To Mortgage Talk with Mark. I'm really glad to be with you guys again and to share some information I've learned over the last few days that I thought might be interesting for some of you, maybe not all of you, but it could be for people that have parents, aging parents, or it could be people like myself who are in that senior market. And I want to kind of talk about some things that a lot of people don't talk about. And so when I come on this show, most of the time I have a guest, but sometimes I don't. I'm always thinking, what am I going to talk about? So this past weekend, I came across an article that I thought was somewhat interesting, at least for me. And the title was "The Top 10 Money and Family Fears for Seniors." I thought that was an interesting subject to talk about because, I'm at a stage of life where these considerations are really on my mind a lot. Um, um, as a matter of fact, I was at coffee this morning with a young man from church. He's 34, a sharp young fellow. We just met a while back and married, got 4 kids. He's really doing very well. And he was saying, he asked me a question toward the end of our coffee. He says, Mark, what is the Lord talking to you about these days? What's in your life at your stage of life? I said, it sounds morbid, but a lot of my conversations in my own head is around the end, what we call the fourth quarter, which I'm clearly at. So a lot of these fears that I'm going to be talking about today are concerns. Let's go over concerns, because fear is kind of a strong word. But a lot of folks, including myself, millions and millions of seniors, I think, have a lot of the same concerns when it comes to aging. And I want to share some of that with you. Now, as you know, the last several months, I've been focusing on my business and my conversation on this channel about reverse mortgages, how home equity can support people in different ways as they age. And I'm going to weave some of that in today because I think it's appropriate. Now, some of these concerns, reverse mortgage has nothing to do with, but at times I want to kind of share some of those strategies that may comfort people who don't know anything about a reverse mortgage. So I'm going to talk about that. But as far as this article goes, and I brought my notes because I'm going to reference these notes because I thought there was a really good article, well written. And it went over 10, what he calls fears, but we're not going to use that language, what we just talked about. We're going to talk about concerns. So number 10 concern, I'm going to count them down from 10 to 1 via this guy's article. He says number 10 is a family conflict over money, okay, which basically means, when somebody passes away or the parents pass away, the kids typically have a will to probate. And sometimes, or maybe a lot of times, there's conflicts over the money because everybody thinks they deserve probably more than they want. An example of that was a friend of mine from church several years ago, Williams, his name, and he was the executor for his father's estate out in West Texas. And his daddy was a physician, done well, and had a big house, and he had assets and whatnot. And William was the second of 4 kids, 4 or 5, I forget. But he was designated the executor, and it took him over 3 years to complete that will through probate because of the family conflicts about who gets what. Now, the father had a clean will. He knew exactly what he wanted at the end, but the kids apparently didn't agree with it. At least William's siblings didn't agree with it, and he had a really hard time. It caused a lot of rift in the family themselves. Relationships were broken, literally. They may have been healed by now. This was a couple of years ago, but it causes a lot of strain and stress with sometimes unless things are spelled out. And a friend of mine who I had on the show about, I don't know, a month or two ago, named Kim Barnes, she and her husband Mike have a company called Parenting Aging Parents, and it's a remarkable website that you may want to check out. Parenting Aging Parents. And I had gone to a workshop with them. It was over 3 weeks, and I learned so much about communication with your kids or your parents. In my case, my parents are gone. Now, we didn't have this sort of challenge per se, but a lot of families do. And so I would recommend you kind of check them out because they're going to give you some things to talk about. I don't know why people like to sweep things under the rug, but a lot of folks think, well, I'm gone, they can figure it out themselves. Well, that's true, but that could cause a lot of problems with the siblings or the heirs themselves, whoever that happens to be. And another one is around blended families. I would say most of America has blended families, including my own. And sometimes that can cause problems too, because, I have a buddy who's now divorced, but he was married for 20 years. He's now a little bit younger than me. He's probably 64. But when he was in 40s, he got remarried to a woman. And then later on, he inherited quite a bit of money. And money that you inherited uh, before, in other words, money that was set aside for you through an inheritance is separate property. He made a mistake by commingling those funds. It was about $1 million, he told me. And his wife at the time didn't have a lot. She didn't come from a lot, but he loved her. I mean, they had a nice marriage. But he said, it caused so much trouble because she thought that his inheritance, at least portion of it, half of it, should go to her kids, his stepkids. He never adopted them, but he had stepkids, and it caused a lot of problems in their marriage to the degree that they got divorced over it. Now, that may be extreme, but that would be an example of family conflict over money, where unless you position yourself correctly, and I've got a friend named Greg Morrison, who's an attorney who's been on this show before as well, says, man, before you, in a second marriage, particularly in a second marriage, you want to make sure things are very well spelled out around the money, because that can be a problem come inheritance time. So that would be number one, family conflict over money. Number two, they say, at least per this article, is leaving nothing behind. I think my generation, well, I guess any generation really, but I think my generation, we want to leave our kids something. It's pretty simple. We want to leave a legacy. Now, a legacy doesn't have to be around money, but a lot of people's thinking is around that. Now, contrary to that is a is a book that a friend of I had breakfast with Randy a while back, and he said, Mark, I'm reading this book about, we're talking about this subject, actually. What are your plans? What are you thinking? What are you going to do? Blah, blah. He says, well, I'm going to leave nothing. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I read this book. It says die with zero. And it's by a guy named Bill Perkins. And I want to read you a little bit about this. He says, imagine if by the time you died, you did everything you were told. You worked hard, you saved your money, and you look forward to financial freedom when you retired. The only thing you wasted along the way was your life. Die with Zero presents a startling new and provocative philosophy, as well as practical personal financial guide on how to get the most out of your money and out of your life. It's intended for those who place lifelong memorable experiences far ahead of simply making and accumulating money for someone's golden years or leaving to your kids. Now, that's not for everybody. I think most people, again, want to leave money behind or assets behind or something to support their kids or their grandkids. Matter of fact, if you had a lot of money, you probably want to set up trust for your grandkids, and that's certainly appropriate. Now, reverse mortgage may come into play around that, because I've had a client, and it wasn't my client, actually. It was a friend of mine's client who had quite a large estate, but he was retired. And so he took some money out of his home, a large amount of money out of his property, his homestead, in a reverse mortgage to buy life insurance. Okay, he bought a large amount of life insurance using some proceeds from his home. So that way he didn't feel bad about spending money in his IRA, or they like to travel. And then he said, man, I've got money set aside for the family through this life insurance program. It's already prepaid. It was what they call a single premium life insurance policy that he could also add more coverage to. It had a disability part of it, that where he got disabled, it would pay some of his care. So he positioned himself well through a single premium life insurance policy using a reverse mortgage. So that may be one strategy, because he wanted to leave something behind, but he also wanted to live his life. He said, man, I've worked hard for 40 years, accumulated several $1 million. And, it's nice to leave something behind, but I want to have a good time myself. So that's what he did. So that's just one example. Number 8 would be financial scams and exploitation. People are concerned with that, and they should be. I'm going to read a stat real quick. It says adults over 60 reported losing more than $3 billion in fraud in 2025. 3 billion with a B, not million. It said fraud losses among older adults increased from approximately $600 million in 2020 to $2.4 billion in 2024. Now, why that is, I don't know, but I can tell you these thieves, these crooks, are becoming much more sophisticated on how they approach elderly. And it doesn't have to be elderly, but I think we're more suspect than others to be trying to be taken advantage of. And so they could be around Medicare, Social Security. A lot of them like to talk about they're from the IRS, things like that. I got a call last week I could tell it was fraud. I could tell just by the nature of the call, because it was a third party. It was a very heavy accident. accent, I should say, Indian or Pakistani, Middle East maybe. And he was saying he was from the Social Security Administration, and that he had some information I needed to talk to him about, and all this sort of thing. It actually had to do with my younger brother who had passed away. That we still owed some money back or to the IRS or something like that. And I immediately hung up because I thought this is just fraud. And he got I questioned him a little bit. And he got angry. Okay, the Social Security Administration, Medicare, IRS, they're not going to call you. If they really need to get a hold of you, they're going to send you certified mail. Okay, that's how they're going to communicate with you, through mail. So that'd just be one example of ways that these scammers try to get into the elderly's pockets, and they do a pretty good job. So they recommend a couple things. Number one, like I did, hang up. Or if they represent a bank, let's say that I got a call one time that they said they were Chase Bank, where I bank. So apparently they either knew that or they were just guessing. But they said they were the bank with Chase Bank, and that it had to do with my accounts. I said, let me do this. Let me call you right back. What is your phone number? Okay. And they wouldn't give it to me. Then I knew that was also a scam, because if they're serious, they'd say, yeah, call me right back at 800, blah, blah, blah. Well, they said, we can't do that. I said, well, I can't talk to you. So I hung up. The other one is a credit freeze. A credit freeze is where you can go to the credit bureaus, Equifax and Experian and TransUnion, and have them freeze your account so nobody could open an account in your name. Another thing we haven't talked about, which is a big conversation, is identity theft. And I had a friend of mine, Jack Wilhelm, on here about 6 months ago, who's an attorney who works a lot in this world of fraud with people who are having these challenges. And he said, and he kind of seconded that statement a minute ago, that fraud is up over 30 or 40, 50% over it was a few years ago even. And so that's a big concern of should be for anybody, but particularly they like to target the seniors because they think they're incapable of making good decisions, or they don't know, or they got a lot of fear around that. So that's number 8. Number 7 is inflation destroying purchasing power. Now, this is a real fear. That's not a fear. That's a reality. That's not, you're not making that one up. Inflation's a real deal. It wasn't a few years under Biden, inflation was 9%. Okay. Social Security cost of living increases around 2 to 3% per year. So if you're relying on pensions, Social Security, things like that, you're going to be what they call fixed income. And fixed income is great that you have an income, but at some point, your dollars are going to be diluted. In other words, even with a low inflation rate of around 3%, something that costs $100 a day in 5 years could be $140. So doubtful that your pension and your Social Security are going to keep up with that in all aspects, And so it used to be, I like to grill, I like to cook, and steak is one of my favorite things to cook. Well, and I like good meat. I like prime beef, from H-E-B. H-E-B is my store. Usually a ribeye. Well, ribeye prices have gone up from about $15 a pound, certainly tenderloins, but prime, ribeye has gone to $14 to $15 a pound, over $20 a pound in the last 5 or 6 years. That's a huge increase. That's a 50% increase. And we talked about eggs. We talk about even a breakfast taco. I paid $5 a day for a breakfast taco. Now, that's a waste of money. So inflation is a real deal. And it could be, as an example, not tacos, breakfast tacos, but things like your home insurance. Home insurance costs in Texas, and maybe around the country too, but certainly in Texas, are up about 40% from 2021 in 5 years, up over 40%. Now, some of that's due to the fact that they, during COVID, they weren't allowed to raise premiums. Okay. So they're trying to make up for lost ground because they've started to settle down now. But our insurance has gone up on our property from $2,800 about 4 or 5 years ago when we bought our property, the last property, to over $4,000. Okay. Now, obviously, my wife and I are still working, so we can make that without a whole lot of problem, but it's still very frustrating, certainly if you're on a fixed income. And so, again, using a reverse mortgage can have a line of credit that you could supplement if you needed to write that extra check out of. I've got a buddy of mine I had coffee with or breakfast with on last Friday. And Scott's been very successful as well in business, and he's done well. He's got a home for about $700,000 near the Dripping Springs area, and he was intrigued by this idea of reverse mortgage. He said, Mark, I really don't need the money. He said, I certainly don't need it now, but I was explaining how this line of credit works, how he could put this line of credit, this growing line of credit on his property that he make access in 5 or 10 years. Now he was going to use it to buy a new motorhome, but but the fact of the matter is, if you have a property paid for, it's better to get a reverse mortgage placed early so the line of credit can grow. Even if you don't need the money now or in 5 years, but in 10 years, you may need that money, assuming you plan on being there in that property the next 10 years, 15 years. So that's another way of offsetting inflation pressures by having access to money through your home. If you don't have a lot of other assets available, a lot of people have a lot of assets or a lot of equity in their in their primary property. So we're talking about insurance, property taxes, home repairs, utilities, prescriptions, caregiving, assisted living, transportation. Gas prices are still pretty high. So I've got a buddy of mine matter of fact, my buddy Scott has a brand new diesel truck. He said, Mark, I pay almost $6 a gallon. I thought, man, are we in California or what? But so inflation's a real deal. And so again, budgeting for that as you age, that's going to be very important. Number 6, he says, is living longer than the money was designed to last. Now, who knows when we're going to be taken out? Okay. Okay. I think about it every day. But he says, living longer is a blessing, but longevity creates financial risk. A person retiring today at 65, for example, who lives to 95 must fund 30 years of that. And I bought my wife and I bought our last property from a couple in Lakeway. It was actually from the state. And it was from the nieces and nephews because they didn't have any children. This couple did. And he lived until 106 and she was 101. Now that's pretty remarkable with no children, but they lived in our home for 40 years as a retirement home. But they lived up until they're over 100 years old. And the nephews told me that they had a reverse mortgage on there because they didn't think they were going to be living till 106 years old. Okay. Now that's unusual. Most people die in their 70s, 80s probably, but the fact of the matter is stats show that men since 1980 are living 5 more years than they were in 1980 and women about 4 more years than 1980. So with medical advances and people taking better care of their health and not smoking as much as they used to, then people are living a lot longer. So unless you're prepared to handle those later years financially, then it's something to be concerned about. I'm certainly concerned about it myself. So when I'm reading this article, I'm thinking about me. I just wanted to share it with you guys because I thought I'm not the only one in the group. Another one is losing a spouse in a significant portion of their income. That'd be a big concern. I've got a friend of mine named Linda. And I used to work with her years ago, and she's 70, about 70, is my guess. And she's lived in her home in South Austin for 35 years. It's paid off, and they're doing fine. And her husband is 80. He's about 10 years older. Now, if he passes away next year and she lives another 15 years, his income is stopped. His Social Security's gone. So what is she going to do? So that's a fear of hers. And so we talked about it a little bit. And again, I'm not trying to sell anything to anybody. That's not what I do. But I do like to inform people of this. And she had heard of reverse mortgage because she had been in the mortgage business. But she wasn't familiar with it. So I showed her some numbers on her property. And we could put a line of credit on her property for around $200,000 based on current value and her age, not his age, because we go by the youngest person. And she could access a $200,000 line of credit. She said, I plan on being here. Now she had 2 girls, 2 grown daughters in Austin. So they could also take care of her. But she said, I really want to stay here if Michael dies. And so we were to show her a $200,000 line of credit that's now growing at about 6.5% per year. So if he lives 5 more years or 6 more years, it could be $300,000 that she would have access to help her offset some of the income that maybe she lost, through him. I'm sorry. And so that would be another concern for folks. Again, when I'm reading these things, I'm thinking about my wife and I. So this is appropriate conversation with me. But the key is to make sure you have these conversations with your kids too, if you have adult kids. And that's why I took Mike and Kim's course, because I didn't need it for me. I'm not parenting aging parents. My parents are gone, but I want to be able in a position to know what I need to know in order to talk to my kids about what our future is, or my future and my wife's future. Losing the ability to stay in your home. I'm doing 2 loans with single widowed women, not single, widowed, 174 and 178. And they're both in a position they're both in very good health. They both have money. And it's not that, but their properties are just not working for them. Both of them, they don't know each other. There's 2 separate situations. One lives more in Lakeway and one lives in South Austin, but they're moving for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons is their home doesn't suit their needs anymore. They've raised their family there. Their husbands are gone. One of them has a large home with an upstairs bedroom, upstairs master, no bedrooms downstairs. It just doesn't work anymore. So they're downsizing, and one of them is using a reverse mortgage because she could pay cash, but she says, Mark, I've only got $800,000. I could live 20 more years. So I showed her the reverse mortgage option. She says, I love that because I can buy my property. It's mine. She has title to it, like we've talked about in the last several months. The bank doesn't take control over it, but she doesn't have a mortgage payment. It's an optional thing. So if she came to some money, she could always pay it down. But she said, I like to have the option of not having to pay that mortgage. So again, losing the ability to stay in your home or making a conscious decision to move because for a variety of reasons. Cynthia has a huge backyard in her house in Oak Hill. She's got like a third of an acre. Well, she said, I'm tired of taking care of this property. I'm just tired of it. I'm not going to do it anymore. So she's moving to more of a garden home with an HOA that takes care of everything except for, her taxes, insurance, and whatnot. So that would be another one, losing the ability to stay in your home. The third one is becoming a burden on your children. And this is one that's probably more common than I'm familiar with. Although we do have some friends, again, from church. Most of our friends are from our church. And her name is Gloria, and she's taking care of her 89-year-old mother, which is a constant battle. Well, I shouldn't say battle. It's probably on some level, it's a blessing, but she's pretty much stuck, taking care of her mother. And so that's another consideration, medical appointments, medications, paying their bills, the physical aspect of caring for elderly, cooking and cleaning. So she's almost 24/7 doing this. And so she has a nice property down in Dripping Springs where her mother lives with her. She's also divorced or widowed, I think, but she has some money, but she doesn't have tons of it. They don't have enough really to have 24-hour care or a whole lot of care. So again, we put a reverse mortgage on her home so it could free her up to just bring somebody in for half a day, to watch her mom, to be with her mother while she goes and has a little bit of life, Otherwise she can't because her mother's got a high level of dementia. And so she loves her mom and she wants to take care of her. But again, it's a problem for her. And so we showed her a way that she could, get a little extra funds to help her mom, to help herself. Actually, it's more for her than for her mom. But except for that, again, is a consideration for a lot of people these days is taking care of aging parents. Another one, and finally, number 2 is paying for long-term care. I don't know the stats on long-term care. I just know it's expensive. I had a client call me last week, and his father-in-law is going into a memory care up in North Austin, or I think it's really toward Belton, and it's $5,000 a month. So, and my client who called me about this because he wanted to brainstorm on some ideas on what to do because they're just not prepared. Now that's again, being prepared for things like that. You can't tell the future, but at least think about the future. What could happen? In this case, they weren't prepared. So, my client is actually paying the memory care place out of his own pocket because he's done well. He's got money. He says, I can't do this forever. So again, we're putting a reverse mortgage on there to buy him some time. They don't know how long father's going to live, maybe another couple of years there. We don't know, but we can buy time for at least 2 years using the equity. Then it's going to take care of the father-in-law and then take care of my client who doesn't want to spend another $200,000 over the next few years. So that's a big one there. I've got a buddy of mine in Houston. He's from Austin, but his mother-in-law she's passed away, but she had a nice home in Houston. and she had 24-hour care. She was 96 years old. Now she had money in a big house and all that good stuff, but they were paying $25,000 a month for live-in 24-hour care. Okay. Now, how long could people do that? 25,000 a month. She could do it for a couple of years, but that's a lot of cash. So that's another thing. And that speaks to the final one, which is running out of money. Okay. Which is basically not preparing for unforeseen things like assisted living or skilled nursing or inflation or anything we've kind of talked about, running out of money. Social Security is just not keeping up. And it won't. It's not designed for that ultimately. Now, people may think it is, but it's not. And I'm so excited. I may have mentioned this. I'm so excited because my first check will be in September. I think September 24th, and I should bring my deposit, my Social Security check, I should say. So I'm very excited about that. But I don't plan on. It won't even pay my mortgage. But it'll help someone. It'll pay for food. It'll pay for that ribeye steak I keep talking about. So what kind of causes some people to run short? Retiring too early. I'll be 67. I'm still working. We could retire, my wife and I, but I'm thinking, no, I like my lifestyle. Claiming Social Security without understanding the effects of Social Security. Market losses in IRAs. That's another one that people don't take consideration. The market's doing well, but what if it's corrected 10% or 20% in the next few years? What are you going to do if you're drawing 4% on an IRA? You're going to have to increase that to 5 or 6 to keep your standard of living. So that could be a problem. That could be another reason for a reverse mortgage, is to supplement that. Let that market correct and ride back up. And so, guys, that's the show today. If you got any questions, call me at 512